The man in the crowd. The airport was alive with movement. The rhythmic drag of rolling suitcases, the hurried tapping of heels on polished floors, the crackle of announcements over the intercom, all blended into a chaotic yet strangely organized symphony. David Sinclair adjusted the straps of his well-worn leather backpack as he walked through the bustling terminal of JFK International Airport. The scent of fresh coffee mixed with the faint hint of jet fuel lingered in the air, reminding him of the thousands of flights departing daily. Dressed in a simple navy blue sweater, dark jeans, and sneakers that had seen better days, David didn't stand out in any way. And that was exactly how he wanted it. To the untrained eye, he was just another traveler. A businessman on a red-eye. A college professor heading to a conference. A regular man with a regular life. But in reality, he was anything but. David Sinclair was the CEO and majority owner of Attendant Airways, one of the most prestigious airline companies in the world. With decades of experience in the aviation industry, he had transformed a struggling airline into an empire known for luxury, efficiency, and innovation. Yet despite his power, he believed in one simple truth: leadership wasn't about sitting in an office. It wasn't about signing contracts or analyzing reports. It was about understanding people. That's why, twice a year, he traveled incognito as a regular passenger, no assistance, no security, no VIP treatment. He wanted to experience what his customers did. The good, the bad, and the unacceptable. And tonight, he was about to encounter all three. Gate 22A, first-class boarding line. The line for first-class boarding moved at a sluggish pace. Some passengers shifted impatiently, checking their watches. Others engaged in quiet conversations, their designer luggage beside them. David remained calm, waiting his turn. He observed everything: how the employees interacted with customers, how smoothly check-ins were handled, and whether every passenger received the respect they deserved. Then he saw her. The gate agent, Stephanie Coleman, stood behind the check-in counter, her uniform pressed to perfection. Her golden name tag shimmered under the bright airport lights. Her hair was neatly tied into a bun so tight it looked like it had been molded into place. She carried herself with an air of authority, rigid posture, sharp eyes that scanned each passenger with calculated precision. But there was something else, too. It wasn't just confidence. It was judgment. David watched as she interacted with the passengers ahead of him. A tall man in an expensive-looking suit approached. She greeted him with a warm smile. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Davenport. Enjoy your flight." A woman draped in a designer coat handed over her ticket. Another smile from Stephanie. "Everything looks great, Ms. Klein. Have a wonderful trip." Then came a young man in his mid-20s, wearing sneakers and a hoodie. The warmth in Stephanie's face vanished instantly. "Sir, are you sure you're in the right line?" she asked coolly. The young man frowned. Yeah. First class." Stephanie hesitated, studying him like a puzzle she didn't trust. Finally, she scanned his ticket. After an uncomfortable pause, she sighed and handed it back. "Fine. Go ahead." David exhaled silently. He had seen this type before. People who treated customers differently based on their appearance. People who assumed wealth had a look. And now, it was his turn. An unwelcome encounter. David stepped forward, offering his ticket with a polite nod. Stephanie barely looked at him before her lips thinned into a straight line. "Sir," she said slowly, "this is the first-class line." David met her gaze. "I know." Her eyes flickered, scanning him up and down. The casual clothes. The worn backpack. The lack of any flashy accessories or status symbols. She sighed, as if he was wasting her time. "Let me see your ticket." David handed it over, watching as she skimmed the details. Her entire demeanor shifted. The muscle in her jaw tightened. Her nostrils flared, just slightly. And then she did something he did not expect. With a sharp, dismissive motion, she tore his ticket in half. The sound of ripping paper seemed to echo louder than the bustling airport around them. David's eyes darkened. Stephanie exhaled, as if she had just rid the terminal of an inconvenience. "I'm sorry, sir," she said, her voice cool and detached. "There must be a mistake. You don't belong in this section." A hushed silence fell over the nearby passengers. A few travelers exchanged awkward glances. Others watched in disbelief. David tilted his head slightly. "A mistake?" Stephanie crossed her arms. "You must have been upgraded by accident. First class isn't for people like," she caught herself, but the implication hung heavy in the air. David remained quiet for a long moment. He could feel the heat of every eye in the surrounding area. It would be so easy to snap. To reveal himself. To call his executive team and have her fired on the spot. But that wasn't how he handled things. Instead, he asked, "Are you sure about this?" Stephanie exhaled sharply, growing impatient. "Sir, I know how to do my job. Security will escort you now." David let out a small chuckle, shaking his head. And then he did something that made her freeze. He smiled. A slow, knowing smile, like someone who had just realized something important. "All right," he said, his voice smooth, almost amused. "Let's see how this plays out." An unfolding scene. Passengers were now wide-eyed, some pulling out their phones. An airport security officer approached, his radio crackling as he received the report. "What's going on here?" The officer asked, his gaze bouncing between David and Stephanie. "This man was trying to board first class with a fraudulent ticket," Stephanie announced. "I already voided it." David said nothing. He simply reached into his pocket, pulled out his wallet, and handed his ID to the officer. The officer scanned it, then glanced at David's face. His brows knitted together. "This says you're David Sinclair." His voice was quieter now. Stephanie scoffed. "So? That doesn't mean anything." The officer's fingers moved quickly across his tablet screen, pulling up a record. Then, he froze. His eyes widened, and his posture stiffened. "Ma'am," he said carefully, turning the screen toward Stephanie. "You might want to look at this." Stephanie leaned in. And then her entire world shattered. David Sinclair, CEO and majority shareholder, Attendant Airways. Her breath caught. Her body went rigid. The realization hit her like a freight train. She had just ripped up the ticket of the man who owned the entire airline. A flicker of panic flashed in her eyes. Passengers started murmuring louder, some recording. David crossed his arms and raised an eyebrow. "Still think I'm in the wrong line?" Stephanie swallowed hard. The security officer turned back to David, standing at full attention now. "Mr. Sinclair, sir," he said. "I sincerely apologize. Would you like a replacement ticket immediately?" David shook his head, but his eyes never left Stephanie. "No need," he said smoothly. "We're going to handle this differently." Stephanie's breathing grew uneven. David took a slow step forward. His voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the weight behind his words. "Miss Coleman," he said. "I think it's time we had a conversation. Right now." A lesson in power. A chilling silence settled over gate 22A. Passengers whispered among themselves. Some subtly lifted their phones, recording every second of the unfolding drama. Others stood frozen, their eyes darting between David Sinclair and the gate agent, Stephanie Coleman. Her face had drained of color. It was one thing to make a mistake. But it was another thing to humiliate the man who owned the entire airline. David's arms were still crossed, his posture calm, almost relaxed. But his piercing gaze told a different story. He didn't need to yell. He didn't need to cause a scene. He was the scene. Stephanie swallowed hard. Sir, I didn't realize. Didn't realize what? David's voice was smooth, but sharp as a scalpel. She hesitated, shifting her weight as if the ground beneath her had suddenly become unsteady. The security officer, now standing stiffly at David's side, was the first to break the silence. Sir, I can radio for a replacement ticket immediately. And if you'd like, I can escort Miss Coleman to speak with management. David held up a hand. No need. His eyes never left Stephanie. The security officer shut his mouth. Stephanie's lips trembled as she forced a nervous smile. Mr. Sinclair, I truly apologize. I was just following standard procedure. David let out a quiet, humorless chuckle. Standard procedure? He tilted his head. I'm curious, does standard procedure include destroying a paying passenger's ticket without cause? She flinched. David's voice remained eerily calm. Or was it something else? Her throat bobbed as she swallowed. Sir, Because let's be clear, he interrupted, stepping closer. You didn't question the man in a designer suit. You didn't question the woman in $1,000 coat. But you saw me, in simple clothes, and suddenly, my ticket had to be checked. Stephanie's fingers twitched. Sir, Then you ripped it up, David continued, his voice dropping an octave. Without even scanning it. Stephanie's breathing grew shallow. The weight of her actions crushed down on her. David gave her a knowing look. Tell me something, Miss Coleman. If I had been wearing a Rolex? A three-piece suit? If I had walked in like I belonged in first class, he leaned in slightly. Would you have even looked twice? She opened her mouth. No words came out. The onlookers knew the answer. And so did she. The airport manager arrives. A sudden burst of footsteps broke the tension. From across the terminal, a man in a sleek navy suit strode toward them. His name tag read Elliot Price, Airport Operations Manager. He was in his mid-50s, with silver-streaked hair and an expression that screamed damage control. Mr. Sinclair, he called, his voice tight with urgency. I just received word of a situation. David turned slightly. You could say that. Elliot reached them and immediately turned to Stephanie. His face was a mask of controlled fury. Miss Coleman, he said, his tone clipped, step aside. Stephanie blinked. Sir, Now. She hesitated before quickly stepping away from the counter. Elliot turned to David, his expression softening into something that resembled panic. Mr. Sinclair, I deeply apologize for this unacceptable experience. Please understand that this does not reflect the values of Attendant Airways. David regarded him for a long moment. Doesn't it? He asked quietly. Elliot hesitated. Because the truth was, it did. Incidents like this didn't happen in isolation. David knew that. This was a symptom of a deeper problem. And he was going to fix it. The tables turn. David adjusted his backpack strap. Tell me, Mr. Price, how do you typically handle incidents like this? Elliot cleared his throat. Well, sir, we take guest satisfaction very seriously. If an employee violates our policies, they're subject to review and possible termination. David's gaze flickered to Stephanie. She stiffened. Somewhere behind the crowd, a voice whispered, she's done for. But David wasn't finished. Termination, he repeated thoughtfully. Elliot nodded. Yes, sir. Of course, if you wish, I can personally ensure that. No. The word came swift, firm. Elliot's mouth snapped shut. Stephanie's breath hitched. David let the silence settle before he spoke again. Firing her won't solve the problem. Elliot looked genuinely confused. Sir? David turned his full attention to Stephanie, who now looked even more nervous than before. Miss Coleman, he said, his voice steady, I could have you removed from this position in an instant. I could make sure you never work in this industry again. Her hands balled into fists. But that would be too easy, David continued. Because in reality, you're not the only one who thinks like this. Stephanie flinched. This is bigger than just you, he said. It's about culture. About the way people in power decide who deserves respect and who doesn't. Her throat tightened. Sir, I truly... You're about to learn something, David cut in. Because I'm not firing you. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Stephanie's eyes widened. You're not? No. Her shoulders sagged in relief, too soon. I'm reassigning you, David said. She blinked. 2. David's smile was slow, deliberate. To a month of field training, he said. As a baggage handler. Stephanie's entire body tensed. What? David stepped closer. You'll work side by side with the employees who do the hardest jobs in this airport. The ones you probably overlook. You'll lift heavy suitcases, stand outside in the cold, deal with frustrated passengers, everything. She gaped at him. David's voice softened, but there was no mistaking the gravity behind it. You'll learn what it feels like to be treated like less. Silence. Elliot cleared his throat awkwardly. Sir, that's... David turned to him. That's my decision, he said. Elliot snapped his mouth shut. Stephanie's face burned red, but she didn't argue. She couldn't. Because deep down, she knew she deserved it. David glanced at the stunned crowd. Then, with a calm expression, he pulled out his phone, made a quick call, and within seconds, a new first-class ticket was issued in his name. The security officer handed it over quickly, his hands almost trembling. David took it without a word. Then he turned back to Stephanie one last time. I hope, he said, that the next time you meet someone like me, you think twice. With that, he walked toward the jet bridge, leaving the stunned gate agent standing in the weight of her own choices. The crowd murmured as he disappeared. Stephanie swallowed. Because for the first time in her life, she was forced to see a shift in perspective. Stephanie Coleman had never felt this small. As she stood frozen at gate 22A, the murmurs of passengers still echoed around her. Some shook their heads in quiet judgment. Others whispered to their companions, their faces a mix of shock and amusement. The man she had humiliated owned the entire airline. And instead of firing her, he had sentenced her to a month as a baggage handler. Her stomach twisted into knots. A month in the freezing cold, working the most physically grueling job in the airport? She had spent years working her way up to the prestigious position of first-class gate agent. She had prided herself on her sharp appearance, her ability to control a situation, her authority behind the counter. And now? She would be lifting suitcases like some entry-level grunt. She glanced toward Elliot Price, the airport operations manager. Maybe he could overturn this? Maybe if she explained that she hadn't meant to treat David Sinclair that way. But the look on Elliot's face told her everything. No one was going to save her. She had made her bed. Now she had to lie in it. A new beginning, but not the one she wanted. The next morning, Stephanie arrived at the employee entrance of the airport, not through the gleaming first-class terminal, but through a grimy back door marked authorized personnel only. A sharp gust of wind blasted through the open tarmac, sending a chill down her spine. She shivered in her thin airport uniform. She had never needed a thick airport coat before. Her job had always been inside, in climate-controlled comfort. Now, she would spend 12-hour shifts outside, in rain, in wind, in the brutal sun. Her stomach churned. A loud, gruff voice jolted her from her thoughts. "You the new recruit?" Stephanie turned sharply. A broad-shouldered woman in a high-visibility orange vest stood in front of her, arms crossed. Her face was lined from years of hard labor, her steel-gray hair pulled into a ponytail. Her uniform was smudged with oil stains and baggage dust. Her name tag read, Linda Morales, Ground Crew Supervisor. Stephanie cleared her throat. Yes. I know who you are," Linda interrupted. Her sharp brown eyes flicked up and down Stephanie's clean uniform. Judging her. Stephanie's cheeks flushed. Linda snorted. "You're the fancy gate agent who pissed off the wrong man. Well, guess what, sweetheart? That counter job ain't gonna help you here." Stephanie bit the inside of her cheek. Linda turned and waved at a group of baggage handlers standing near a conveyor belt, their breath visible in the morning cold. "Listen up, team. We got ourselves a new trainee. Let's see how long she lasts." The baggage crew turned to look at Stephanie. Some smirked. Others whispered. A few shook their heads. They all knew the story. Everyone at the airport did. Stephanie clenched her fists at her sides. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. She would prove them wrong. Reality hits hard. Her first task seemed simple enough. Load the suitcases onto the baggage cart. Easy, right? Wrong. Stephanie crouched, reaching for a large black duffel bag. The moment she tried to lift it, her arms screamed in protest. What the hell was in this bag? Bricks? She gritted her teeth, her muscles trembling as she barely managed to hoist it onto the conveyor belt. The other baggage handlers snickered. "Better pick up the pace, princess," one of them called out. Stephanie ignored them. She wouldn't let them get to her. But the bags kept coming. Some were oversized suitcases. Others were misshapen duffels. Then there were the hard shell rollers that looked sleek and compact, until she tried to lift one and nearly fell backward. She had never realized how much work this job took. By the time she finished loading just one baggage cart, her arms burned, her back ached, and sweat clung to her skin. And she still had 7 more carts to go. Linda strolled by, sipping a lukewarm coffee. "Still standing?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. Stephanie straightened, swallowing back a grimace. "I'm fine." Linda smirked. "We'll see." And she walked away. Stephanie turned back to the mountain of bags and kept working. A day in the life of the overlooked. Stephanie's entire body hurt. Her arms. Her legs. Even muscles she didn't know existed ached from hours of lifting, bending, and hauling. She had always looked at baggage handlers as background workers, people she passed by without a second thought. But today, she saw them differently. They weren't just throwing bags around. They were tracking fragile items. They were handling lost luggage. They were stacking heavy loads with precision to make sure planes were balanced correctly. They worked in the heat. In the cold. In the rain. And no one thanked them. Passengers only noticed them when something went wrong. For the first time in her life, Stephanie understood what it felt like to be invisible. And it humbled her. A hard lesson from Linda. Near the end of her shift, Linda pulled Stephanie aside. The older woman leaned against a baggage cart, studying her. "You're still here." Stephanie wiped sweat from her forehead. "Yeah." Linda chuckled. "I figured you'd quit by lunch." Stephanie frowned. "You wanted me to quit?" Linda shrugged. Doesn't matter what I wanted. You needed to learn. Stephanie swallowed. Learn what? Linda's expression turned serious. What it feels like when people treat you like you don't matter. Stephanie's chest tightened. You gate agents look at us like we're just the help, Linda continued. Like we're some nameless part of the machine that keeps this airport running. Stephanie opened her mouth to argue, but she couldn't. Because Linda was right. She had been that person. Linda sighed and pushed off the cart. Look, I don't know if you're gonna change. But I do know this, how you treat people says everything about you. Stephanie nodded slowly. She had spent her entire career obsessed with rules, appearances, authority. But today had shown her something more important. Respect. And how easy it was to take it away from someone. Stephanie watched as Linda walked back to the crew. For the first time since this all started. She wasn't thinking about herself. She was thinking about the people she had ignored for years. And maybe, just maybe, this month wasn't about punishment. Maybe it was a second chance. Breaking barriers. Stephanie Coleman dragged herself into the airport's employee locker room, her body aching from the brutal 12-hour shift. Her muscles screamed with every step, her once pristine uniform now smudged with grease, dirt, and sweat. Her manicured nails, once a symbol of her polished professionalism, were chipped, her hands raw from the endless lifting. But the worst part? No one cared. There were no executive lounges, no complimentary coffee, no appreciative nods from passengers thanking her for her service. Instead, she was just another exhausted baggage handler, melting into the background. She collapsed onto the metal bench and peeled off her safety gloves. Every inch of her body throbbed. The locker room smelled of stale coffee, damp uniforms, and exhaustion. Other workers sat slumped against the walls, scrolling on their phones, rubbing their sore arms, or just staring blankly at the lockers. Stephanie exhaled, staring at her reflection in the cracked mirror across the room. This was her life now. And for the first time since she had been humiliated at Gate 22A, she wondered. What if I never get my old job back? What if David Sinclair, the billionaire she had insulted, decided this was where she belonged? Would she survive? A glimpse of change. Her answer came the next day. The airport was chaotic. A massive storm had cancelled over 40 flights, and passengers were furious. Stephanie wasn't dealing with angry customers anymore. But baggage chaos was its own brand of nightmare. Suitcases were piling up in mountains in the luggage sorting area. The conveyor belts were jammed with unclaimed bags. Passengers were flooding the claims desk, demanding their lost belongings. The baggage handlers were understaffed. Overworked. Frustrated. And no one from upper management was coming to help. Stephanie overheard one of the veteran baggage handlers, Carlos, muttering under his breath. They only notice us when something goes wrong, he grumbled. His word struck a nerve. Stephanie had spent years looking down on people like Carlos. And now? She was one of them. She inhaled deeply and squared her shoulders. No more self-pity. It was time to get to work. A test of strength. The first task of the day? Sorting through the backlog of lost luggage. Stephanie crouched near the conveyor belt, lifting bag after bag, matching the tags with their destinations. A toddler's pink polka-dot suitcase was bound for Denver. A soldier's camouflage duffel bag was rerouted to Texas. A businesswoman's sleek silver roller case had to be rushed to Miami before her international connection. Each bag had a story. A person waiting on the other side, hoping their belongings wouldn't vanish into the abyss of lost luggage. Stephanie worked alongside the others, moving faster than before. She was still slower than the veterans, but they didn't mock her anymore. Linda, The tough-as-nails ground supervisor even gave her a nod of approval. Stephanie wasn't just surviving the job. She was learning it. And for the first time, she realized something surprising. She didn't hate it. A customer in need. Just as the chaos seemed under control, an elderly woman in a tattered coat shuffled into the baggage claim area. Her frail hands clutched a yellow baggage slip, her eyes darting anxiously around the room. No one paid her any attention. Stephanie watched as the woman hesitated before timidly approaching the front desk. The agent behind the counter was swamped and barely glanced at her. "Miss, please wait your turn," the agent said, sighing. Stephanie's stomach tightened. She had said those exact words so many times before. The woman swallowed hard and stepped back, gripping the counter. Stephanie couldn't ignore her. She left her post and walked over. "Ma'am, do you need help?" The woman turned, eyes filled with relief. "Oh, yes, dear. My luggage, it never arrived." Stephanie took the slip and glanced at the tracking number. She quickly checked the system on the nearby monitor. Her stomach sank. Her suitcase had been accidentally rerouted to Chicago. And the next flight back wouldn't arrive until tomorrow night. Stephanie hesitated. The old Stephanie would have just told the woman to wait. Company policy was company policy. But the new Stephanie? She saw the exhaustion in the woman's eyes. The way her thin coat barely shielded her from the airport's chilly air. She turned to Linda. "Can I do a manual claim override?" Linda raised an eyebrow. "Why?" Stephanie stood firm. "Because she doesn't have another night to wait." There was a pause. Then, to Stephanie's surprise, Linda nodded. "Go for it." Stephanie quickly filled out a priority luggage request, ensuring the suitcase would be personally delivered to the woman's hotel within a few hours. When she turned back to the woman, she was met with tears. "Oh, bless you, sweetheart," the woman whispered, squeezing Stephanie's hands. A warmth spread through Stephanie's chest. For the first time in her career, she had done something that wasn't about rules or policies. She had helped someone. Simply because it was the right thing to do. A surprise visit. As the shift ended, Stephanie felt something she hadn't felt in years. Pride. Not the shallow kind that came from a polished uniform or a strict rulebook. But the kind that came from earning respect. She was tossing her gloves into her locker when a voice stopped her cold. "Seems like you're learning something, Miss Coleman." Her heart nearly jumped out of her chest. David Sinclair. The billionaire himself stood in the doorway, arms crossed. He was no longer dressed in casual clothes. Instead, he wore a tailored suit that screamed wealth and power. But this time, Stephanie didn't see just a rich man. She saw the owner of a company who actually cared. She quickly wiped her hands on her uniform. "Mr. Sinclair." He held up a hand. "No excuses. Just tell me, how's the experience?" Stephanie hesitated. Then she answered honestly. "It's hard. But I needed this." David studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Good." Then he pulled something from his pocket and placed it in her hands. A first-class boarding pass. Stephanie's breath caught in her throat. Her return to the front desk. "Already?" She looked up at him, confused. "But I still have 2 weeks left." David smiled. "I know. But I've seen enough." And then, just before he turned to leave, he said something that would stay with her forever. "You don't earn respect by wearing a fancy uniform, Miss Coleman. You earn it by understanding the people around you." And for the first time in her life, Stephanie truly understood the moment of truth. Stephanie sat frozen on the cold, metal bench of the employee locker room, the first-class boarding pass still clutched in her hands. It felt surreal. 2 weeks ago, she had been humiliated at gate 22A, demoted to baggage handling, stripped of everything she had worked for. Now, David Sinclair, the billionaire owner of Sky America Airlines, had personally given her the opportunity to return to her former position. Her old life was within reach. But instead of feeling victorious, she hesitated. A crossroads. She should have been thrilled. She should have rushed out of that locker room, fixed her uniform, and prepared to reclaim her desk at the front of the airline. But something held her back. She had spent the last 2 weeks with the very workers she had once dismissed, baggage handlers, maintenance crews, janitors, and ground staff. She had struggled alongside them, fought exhaustion with them, and witnessed firsthand how vital they were to the company. And yet, no one respected them. No one noticed their sacrifices. No one rewarded their effort. Not even her, until now. Stephanie looked at the pass in her hands. If she returned to her old job, would she fall back into old habits? Would she forget everything she had learned? She took a deep breath. No. Not this time. She wasn't going back as the same person. If she was going to return, she was going to do it differently. A new beginning. The next morning, Stephanie arrived at the corporate office of Sky America Airlines. Her uniform was spotless. Polished shoes. Crisp blouse. Hair neatly tied back. But she wasn't here for just her old position. She had a plan. Stephanie walked into the executive wing, where the higher-ups made all the real decisions. The hallways were lined with portraits of CEOs past and present, reminders of the company's legacy. Her heart pounded as she approached David Sinclair's office. His assistant glanced up in surprise. "Mr. Sinclair isn't expecting you, Miss Coleman." Stephanie smiled confidently. "That's okay. He'll want to hear what I have to say." A pause. Then, "Wait here." Face to face with power. 5 minutes later, she was sitting across from David Sinclair. He leaned back in his chair, studying her with sharp, assessing eyes. "I assumed you'd be at the front desk by now," he said. "But something tells me that's not why you're here." Stephanie exhaled slowly. "No, sir. I need to talk to you about something bigger than my job." David raised an eyebrow but gestured for her to continue. She leaned forward. "These last 2 weeks changed me," she admitted. "I used to think the ground crews were just background noise. People who didn't matter. But I was wrong." She paused, her voice gaining strength. "They are the foundation of this company. And they deserve better." David steepled his fingers. "Go on." Stephanie took a deep breath. "I want to propose changes, real changes, for how Sky America treats its employees." She laid out her plan. Higher wages for ground crew and baggage handlers. Better working conditions and scheduled breaks. Recognition programs for employees who go above and beyond. Training and promotion opportunities for lower-level staff. David listened without interrupting. When she finally finished, her hands were trembling. Would he dismiss her? Tell her she was out of line? Instead, he smiled. "That's quite a proposal," he said. "And very different from the woman I met at gate 22A. Stephanie met his gaze. "Because I'm not that woman anymore." A long silence stretched between them. Then, David leaned forward. "You've learned something most executives never do, Miss Coleman. And I respect that." He slid a document across the desk. Stephanie glanced down, and her breath caught in her throat. A promotion contract. "Assistant Operations Manager," she read aloud, eyes wide. David nodded. "You've proven you understand the people who keep this airline running. That's the kind of leadership we need." Stephanie was speechless. She had walked into this office expecting a fight. Instead, she was being given the chance of a lifetime. More than redemption. As she signed the contract, a realization hit her. Her journey had started with humiliation. She had been knocked down, stripped of her pride, and forced to see the world from the other side. But instead of breaking her, it had made her stronger. Stephanie wasn't just reclaiming her old job. She was stepping into a new future. A future where she wouldn't just enforce the rules. She would change them.